The private jet gleamed under the morning sun as it waited patiently on the tarmac, its sleek white body reflecting the bright light, giving it an almost untouchable, perfect appearance. Inside, the cabin was quiet, luxurious, and spotless, with soft leather seats, polished wooden panels, and subtle ambient lighting that made the entire space feel calm, exclusive, and controlled. Every detail had been carefully arranged to make passengers feel comfortable, safe, and, most importantly, in control of the world outside. On the outside, everything looked serene, but inside, a storm of personalities and tension was quietly brewing, invisible to anyone who might glance at the jet from afar. The flight attendant, a woman in her early 30s, walked down the aisle with measured steps, checking the seats, straightening the cushions, and ensuring that every detail of the cabin was perfect. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from years of experience, but there was something about today that made her alert in a way she had never been before. Her eyes scanned the cabin carefully, noting small things, an errant magazine left on the side table, the angle of a pillow, the way the seatbelt was resting on a chair. Everything had to be perfect because this wasn't just any flight, it was a flight with someone powerful, someone used to being in control, someone whose ego could fill the cabin faster than the air conditioning could cool it. Moments later, the CEO and his team arrived. He was a tall, commanding man in his 40s, impeccably dressed, exuding confidence and authority with every step. His presence seemed to fill the cabin immediately, making it hard for anyone else to even feel like they had space. His team followed closely behind, a group of professionals who had clearly been chosen for their loyalty and efficiency. They were polite but stiff, aware that they were not just on a flight, but part of a performance that demanded precision, poise, and silent obedience. The CEO's eyes swept across the cabin, his gaze sharp and assessing, as if he were evaluating not just the flight attendant, but every single detail of the jet itself. The flight attendant met his gaze calmly. She had been trained to handle high-profile passengers, to anticipate their needs, and to maintain professionalism no matter how difficult they were. Yet, something about him immediately set her on edge. There was a sense of arrogance in the way he moved, a subtle assertion that this cabin, and indeed, this flight, was under his command. She had faced demanding passengers before, but she knew from experience that some egos weren't just difficult, they were dangerous, capable of creating chaos if not managed carefully. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay focused, to stay in control, and not to let anyone's attitude unsettle the calm she had carefully cultivated in the cabin. The hum of the engines began, a low, comforting vibration that reminded everyone on board that soon, they would be soaring above the clouds. The soft clink of the CEO's accessories, his watch, his cufflinks, the briefcase he carried, mixed with the faint sound of footsteps on the polished floor, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, a subtle luxury scent that hinted at wealth, power, and control. Yet underneath all this sophistication, the atmosphere was tense. There was an unspoken challenge hanging in the air, a silent question of authority and respect that neither party had addressed yet but would soon become impossible to ignore. As the jet prepared for takeoff, the flight attendant went through her mental checklist one last time. Safety procedures, passenger comfort, personal boundaries, all of it had to be perfect. She straightened her uniform, adjusted her posture, and made sure her calm demeanor was in place. The CEO, meanwhile, had already settled into his seat, leaning back with a confident smirk, seemingly relaxed but clearly observing everything and everyone around him. His team quietly took their seats, occasionally glancing at him for signals, waiting to see how he would handle the flight. It was a strange balance of power. On one side, there was the CEO and his team, accustomed to being in control, used to issuing commands, and rarely challenged. On the other side, there was the flight attendant, trained to manage difficult personalities, calm emergencies, and maintain order in an environment where she could technically lose control if even one passenger's behavior escalated. The jet, luxurious and silent, became the perfect stage for what was about to unfold. The quiet moments before takeoff felt stretched, almost like the calm before a storm, as if the cabin itself could sense the drama that was quietly building, ready to erupt at any moment. No one on board yet knew what would happen next, but the scene was set: a powerful CEO, a confident and experienced flight attendant, and a jet that represented both luxury and authority. The stage was ready, the players were in place, and the first sparks of conflict were about to ignite in a story that no one aboard would ever forget. As the private jet lifted off the runway, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady reminder that they were now soaring high above the clouds, isolated from the world below. The flight attendant moved calmly down the aisle, her hands carefully adjusting seat belts and checking that every passenger was comfortable, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the CEO, who had settled himself into the largest seat at the front of the cabin, radiating authority and impatience. The CEO's eyes scanned the cabin critically, lingering on small details that most people would never notice: the angle of a pillow, the placement of a magazine, the way the ambient light reflected off the polished wood. His body language was controlled, yet there was a subtle tension in the way he tapped his fingers on the armrest, a silent signal that he expected perfection and, more importantly, immediate obedience. His team watched him closely, whispering to each other, trying to anticipate his next command, the air around them heavy with unspoken anxiety. The flight attendant approached with a tray of refreshments, smiling politely. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. Her tone was friendly but firm, reflecting years of experience handling demanding passengers. She placed the tray on the fold-out table, aligning it precisely in front of him, conscious of the smallest details that could make the difference between satisfaction and irritation. The CEO glanced at the tray and frowned slightly, not because anything was wrong with the drinks, but because he wanted to assert control. "Are you sure you've arranged this correctly?" he asked, his voice carrying a subtle edge, a challenge hidden behind politeness. It wasn't a question about service, it was a test, an attempt to remind everyone on board that he was in charge. The flight attendant's calm demeanor didn't waver. She nodded slightly. "Everything is in order, sir, but if you'd like, I can adjust it to your preference," she replied, her tone polite but unmistakably firm. There was no hesitation, no apology, only confidence, a quiet assertion that she would not be intimidated or rushed. The first spark of tension flared, small but undeniable, like a candle flickering in the wind. The CEO leaned back in his seat, studying her closely, trying to gauge whether she would buckle under his authority. "I've flown on dozens of private jets," he said casually. "I know how things should be done." There was a subtle implication in his words, a warning that he expected compliance and that any resistance would not be tolerated. His team sat silently, watching, waiting to see how she would respond. The flight attendant didn't flinch, her eyes meeting his with quiet determination. "I understand, sir, and I strive to provide the best service possible on every flight. I also believe that safety, respect, and professionalism should guide every interaction on board," she said, her words clear and deliberate, not confrontational, yet carrying a firmness that left no doubt about her boundaries. The CEO's expression tightened slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. His ego, used to unquestioned authority, didn't like being challenged, even subtly. By now, the cabin felt charged with tension, invisible but palpable, as if the air itself had thickened with the unspoken battle for control. Passengers in other sections felt the undercurrent, the subtle clash of personalities that had turned a routine flight into something extraordinary. For the next few minutes, small disagreements kept popping up, trivial things at first: a tray slightly out of place, a seat adjusted without permission, a request misunderstood, but each one added fuel to the quiet fire growing between them. The CEO's tone remained polite but sharp, the flight attendant's responses calm but unyielding. Every interaction became a delicate dance, a test of patience, power, and composure. The tension built slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon, invisible at first but impossible to ignore as it approached. By the time the jet reached cruising altitude, the cabin had transformed from a space of luxury and calm into a stage of subtle conflict. Everyone on board could feel it, the CEO's frustration simmering beneath the surface, the flight attendant's unshakable composure standing as a quiet challenge to his authority. The team watched, caught between loyalty to their leader and the growing awareness that the balance of power was shifting. The atmosphere was tense, electric, and impossible to ignore, signaling that something dramatic was about to happen. No one yet knew what the breaking point would be, but the first clear signs of conflict were undeniable. subtle gestures, sharp glances, quiet refusals, each small action and reaction added to the tension, creating an invisible countdown to a moment that would change the dynamic of the flight forever. What began as a routine journey was now a simmering drama, the story of authority, ego, and courage quietly unfolding above the clouds. Tension had been quietly building in the cabin for the entire flight, a barely visible storm swirling beneath the polished surfaces of leather seats and wooden panels. The CEO's patience, already thin, had worn even thinner with every small correction, every calm refusal, and every polite assertion of authority by the flight attendant. His ego, accustomed to unquestioned control, now bristled against the invisible wall she had quietly erected. It started with a small disagreement over his seat adjustment, a trivial matter that most would have ignored, but to him, it was a challenge to his comfort and authority. "Why is my seat not fully reclined?" he asked sharply, his voice low but filled with irritation. The flight attendant, standing just a few feet away, looked at him calmly and explained that the seat mechanism required careful adjustment to avoid damage. Her tone was even, respectful, yet firm, a combination that immediately irritated him more. The CEO leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need instructions, I know what I'm doing," he said, his words carrying the weight of authority, as if the cabin itself should bend to his will. His team shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing friction and wondering if it would escalate further. The flight attendant met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch, refusing to step back. "I understand, sir, but I must ensure everything is done safely and correctly. I'm here to make your flight smooth, but safety comes first," she replied, her voice calm, confident, and unyielding. There was no hint of fear, no sign that she would yield to intimidation. Her presence alone challenged the CEO in a way he had not experienced before. The atmosphere in the cabin suddenly felt heavier, as if every luxury item, every polished surface, every subtle detail of comfort had been replaced with invisible tension. The CEO's hands clenched slightly on the armrest, his jaw tight, and a dangerous flash of anger crossed his eyes. His team tried to intervene with gentle reassurances, whispering, "It's fine, relax, she's just doing her job." But their words barely penetrated the storm brewing between the two. Then it happened, the moment that would become the center of the story. The CEO reached out, gesturing in frustration toward the seat adjustment, his hand moving too close, too aggressively, to the flight attendant. She reacted instantly, with reflexes honed by years of experience in high-pressure situations. Her hand shot up, connecting sharply with his face, and a loud, unmistakable smack echoed in the quiet cabin. Gasps filled the air, sharp and sudden, as passengers and team members alike turned toward the source of the sound. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and a moment of stunned silence froze everyone in place. The CEO touched his face, shock and disbelief mixing with anger, unable to comprehend that someone had just dared to strike him. The flight attendant stood her ground, her posture firm, her gaze unwavering. The message was clear: this cabin, and this flight, would not be ruled by arrogance or intimidation. The CEO's team froze, unsure how to react. Their leader, usually the center of every decision and every action, was momentarily disarmed, the very symbol of authority humbled by a single, decisive act. The passengers whispered among themselves, some in shock, some in disbelief, others secretly impressed by the flight attendant's courage and composure. The mood of the cabin shifted instantly. The air now charged with a mix of tension, surprise, and anticipation. For a few long seconds, neither the CEO nor the flight attendant spoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The flight attendant, calm and resolute, broke the silence. "I will not tolerate disrespect or unsafe behavior in this cabin. We are all professionals here, and everyone must act accordingly," she said, her voice steady, confident, and authoritative. Her words, simple and direct, carried the full weight of her stance, leaving no room for argument. The CEO, still stunned, struggled to regain control, his ego bruised, his authority challenged in a way that few had ever dared. The crew and passengers watched closely, realizing that the dynamics of the flight had completely shifted in an instant. What had started as a routine journey was now a stage for a dramatic battle of power, respect, and courage. The flight attendant had made her position clear, and the CEO had no choice but to acknowledge it, at least for the moment. The cabin, once quiet and luxurious, had become a place of drama, tension, an undeniable human confrontation. Each person on board felt the shift, sensing that this was no ordinary flight, that what had just occurred would have consequences far beyond this moment. The private jet, a symbol of wealth and control, had now witnessed a bold challenge to authority, setting the stage for events that would escalate even further in the minutes to come. The sound of the smack still echoed in the cabin, bouncing off the leather seats and polished wood, leaving a stunned silence that felt almost tangible. Passengers froze mid-motion, some gripping the armrests of their seats, others turning slowly to see what had just happened. Their eyes widened, mouths slightly open, as they tried to process the audacity of what they had just witnessed. The CEO's hand flew to his cheek, still tingling from the unexpected impact. His usual composure was gone, replaced by shock, confusion, and a flash of anger that no amount of training could conceal. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince himself that it had not really happened. The reality of it, however, was impossible to deny, and the moment had changed everything. His team, seated just a few feet away, scrambled to assess the situation, whispering urgently to each other, "Should we say something? Should we step in?" Their voices were low, filled with nervous tension, as if speaking too loudly might make the situation worse. They were trained professionals, loyal to their leader, yet none of them had ever encountered a moment like this. A simple act, a single slap, had completely overturned the dynamics they had taken for granted. Meanwhile, the flight attendant remained perfectly still, her posture firm, her gaze unwavering. She did not flinch, she did not step back, and she did not apologize. Her calm presence acted like a shield, holding the cabin together even as tension crackled in the air. Every passenger and crew member could sense her quiet authority, the kind that demanded respect without raising a voice or repeating a command. A few moments passed in silence, the only sounds coming from the low hum of the engines and the occasional shuffle of someone adjusting their seat. The CEO slowly looked up, his eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for an explanation, a justification, or perhaps even a way to reclaim control. His team watched anxiously, sensing his internal struggle and trying to guess how he might react next. Some passengers whispered to one another, barely audibly, "Did she really just do that?" And, "I've never seen anything like this." Their voices carried a mixture of shock, disbelief, and admiration. The cabin had transformed from a space of luxury and comfort into a stage of raw human emotion, where the usual rules of behavior seemed suddenly suspended. One of the CEO's assistants finally spoke up, a nervous attempt to calm the situation. "Sir, maybe we should," but he was cut off by a sharp glance from the CEO, his eyes still wide with a mixture of pain and outrage. The words never reached the flight attendant, and even if they had, she would not have faltered. The atmosphere had shifted too much for small interventions to matter. The CEO exhaled slowly, trying to regain some sense of control, yet his usual confidence was shaken. His team leaned in, whispering suggestions, trying to reassure him, but the reality was clear. This flight was no longer his domain in the way he expected. Someone had challenged him directly, and it was impossible to ignore. Passengers who had initially tried to avoid noticing the conflict now watched with fascination, unable to tear their eyes away. The drama unfolding in front of them was more captivating than any movie, more intense than any boardroom scandal they had ever heard of. The flight attendant's composure and the CEO's stunned silence created a dynamic that everyone could feel but few could articulate. Even the crew who were not directly involved moved cautiously, aware of the tension, careful not to make any sudden moves. Their training told them to maintain order, to ensure safety, and to protect passengers. Yet in that moment, the usual rules of protocol seemed fragile, almost irrelevant, as the raw human drama took center stage. And in that charged silence, a clear message had been sent to everyone aboard the jet. Both the CEO and his team realized, whether consciously or not, that power could be challenged, that authority could be questioned, and that consequences could arrive in unexpected ways. The flight attendant had not just reacted physically, she had shifted the balance of the entire cabin, and no one would ever forget the moment. After the slap, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. The quiet luxury of the jet was replaced by a tension that felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened around every seat and every passenger. The CEO, usually the center of authority, now seemed uncertain, his confidence shaken, and for the first time, his team hesitated to act without thinking. The flight attendant, meanwhile, remained composed, her body language calm yet commanding. She moved with purpose, checking on the passengers, adjusting their comfort, and handling the remaining service tasks as if nothing extraordinary had happened, yet every step she took reinforced her authority, making it clear that the power on this flight had shifted. The CEO attempted to regain control, leaning slightly forward and speaking in measured tones. "I don't think that was necessary," he said, trying to assert dominance, but the words lacked the force they usually carried. They were tempered by his own disbelief, his surprise at being confronted so directly. His team exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to support him or to silently acknowledge the flight attendant's control. Passengers could feel the subtle change in energy, the invisible but undeniable shift in who was in charge. The cabin that had seemed so orderly and predictable was now charged with a sense of unpredictability, where respect was no longer assumed and authority had to be earned. The flight attendant's calm, confident presence contrasted sharply with the CEO's shaken demeanor, creating a clear imbalance. Every minor interaction now highlighted the new dynamics. Even when serving drinks or adjusting the temperature, the flight attendant's movements carried a quiet command, a reminder that she had the final say in the space she controlled. Her authority was not aggressive but undeniable, a careful mix of professionalism and assertiveness that left no room for disrespect. The CEO's team, who had always been confident and loyal, began to second-guess themselves, their usual certainty replaced by hesitation. Each glance, each gesture, seemed now to require approval or careful thought. They could feel the shift, though none of them wanted to admit it openly. The flight attendant had managed to turn the unspoken rules of hierarchy upside down, and everyone could sense the change. Even small actions, like adjusting a blanket or checking on a passenger's comfort, became symbolic. Each act by the flight attendant reinforced her position, each quiet correction or polite refusal a reminder that she was no longer simply following orders. She was leading. The CEO, once untouchable, was now subject to her control, and the reality of it slowly began to sink in. Some passengers began to whisper, exchanging looks that mixed surprise with admiration. They realized that the flight attendant's confidence and courage had shifted the balance of power in ways that no one could have predicted. What had been a routine flight with a high-profile CEO and his team was now a lesson in respect, authority, and accountability. The dynamics in the cabin had transformed from predictable to electrifying. The CEO, still trying to process the situation, finally leaned back and exhaled. A subtle acknowledgement passed over his face that he could not assert control through his usual means. The flight attendant's composure had exposed the limits of his authority, and for the first time, he felt vulnerable in front of his own team and the passengers. In those moments, it became clear to everyone aboard that the rules of hierarchy were not absolute, that authority could be challenged respectfully but firmly, that confidence and professionalism could outweigh arrogance and entitlement. The flight attendant had not only defended herself but had subtly demonstrated that power could be balanced with dignity and courage. By the time the CEO attempted to speak again, the shift was complete. His team no longer moved automatically on his commands, the passengers now viewed him differently, and the cabin itself had transformed into a stage where the true dynamics of respect, authority, and courage had been revealed. The flight attendant's decisive actions had permanently altered the perception of power in this confined, high-stakes environment. The cabin had fallen into a tense silence, the subtle shift of power now fully apparent. The CEO, though still seated in his oversized leather chair, no longer carried the unshakable confidence that had defined him moments earlier. His team, usually quick to respond and always aligned with his commands, now hesitated, glancing nervously at each other as if uncertain of their place. The flight attendant, calm and composed, moved down the aisle with deliberate precision, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the reactions of passengers and staff alike. She had done what no one expected, asserting authority in a way that disrupted the usual hierarchy, but now she knew that a clear, decisive consequence was necessary to solidify control and maintain order. She stopped in front of the CEO, her expression unreadable but firm. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of finality, "the behavior exhibited during this flight cannot be tolerated, and the same applies to your team. The professionalism expected on this flight has been compromised, and there must be accountability." Her words were not shouted, not aggressive, but precise, direct, and commanding, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. The CEO's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the armrest, as if trying to grasp onto his remaining control. "Are you serious?" he asked, disbelief lacing every word. The room seemed to hold its breath as the team shifted in their seats, realizing that the quiet, efficient flight attendant was about to make a move no one had anticipated. Without hesitation, she continued, her gaze unwavering, "Yes, sir, I am serious. The actions, attitudes, and lack of respect displayed during this flight have consequences, and therefore, effective immediately. Your team's services under your direction are terminated, their roles on this flight are concluded, and they will not be permitted to continue in their current positions." The words were simple, unyielding, and utterly shocking to everyone on board. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. The CEO's team stared at her, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend that a single flight attendant had just fired them. Their authority, tied entirely to the CEO, had evaporated in a moment, replaced by a stark realization that they were no longer in control, and that consequences had arrived in the most dramatic way possible. The CEO leaned forward, his anger barely contained, his voice low but fierce. "You can't do this. You have no authority over my team," he said, yet there was a subtle hesitation, an acknowledgement that she, in this confined space, had indeed assumed control. His team glanced nervously between him and the flight attendant, unsure whether to speak, move, or resist. The flight attendant, unshaken, replied evenly, "Authority on this flight is defined by professionalism and respect, not by titles or status. Sir, your team's conduct has violated that principle, and therefore the decision is final. The situation demands accountability, and this is the consequence." Her calm decisiveness left no room for argument, and for the first time, the CEO realized that his usual methods of intimidation were ineffective. Passengers watched with wide eyes, some whispering in disbelief, others secretly impressed by the audacity and courage of the flight attendant. The scene felt almost cinematic, a real-life drama unfolding at 30,000 feet, where rules of power, respect, and accountability played out in front of a captive audience. For the CEO's team, the moment was surreal, the consequences immediate, and the lesson undeniable. The flight attendant had not only defended her own authority but had demonstrated that respect and professionalism were not negotiable, even for the highest-ranking individuals on board. Every glance, every word, every gesture reinforced that power must be earned through conduct, not assumed by position alone. The CEO, now fully aware of the seriousness of the situation, leaned back in his seat, his face a mixture of disbelief, anger, and reluctant respect. His team sat in stunned silence, absorbing the reality that their roles, temporarily secure before, had been undone by a single act of courage. The flight attendant had redefined authority in this confined space, making it clear that professionalism was the ultimate measure of power. As the jet continued its flight, the tension slowly shifted from shock to reflection. The consequences had been delivered, and their impact was undeniable. This was no longer just a flight, it was a lesson in respect, courage, and accountability. The flight attendant had not just asserted control, she had reshaped the dynamics of authority in a way that would be remembered by everyone on board long after the plane landed. The cabin was quiet now, but the silence felt heavy, loaded with the weight of what had just happened. The CEO sat back in his oversized seat, his usual air of invincibility replaced by a rare vulnerability. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the events, the audacity of the flight attendant, and the sudden loss of control over his team. For the first time, he realized that wealth, status, and titles did not automatically guarantee respect. His team, still reeling from the abrupt termination, exchanged glances that mixed fear, disbelief, and grudging respect. Some had been loyal for years, but loyalty alone had not shielded them from accountability. The lesson was clear, painful, and immediate. Actions have consequences, and even the most powerful are not above the rules of professionalism. Passengers remained wide-eyed, some quietly talking among themselves in hushed tones, others staring out the window at the clouds, reflecting on what they had witnessed. To them, this flight had become more than just travel, it had become a dramatic story of courage, authority, and consequences. A routine journey had turned into a vivid example of how character, confidence, and professionalism can alter even the most rigid hierarchies. The flight attendant moved calmly through the cabin, checking on passengers with the same measured attention she had maintained all along. Her demeanor had not wavered, yet everyone on board sensed the subtle shift in energy that she had created. The atmosphere, once tense and charged, had transformed into one of quiet reflection, respect, and recognition of the courage it took to act decisively under pressure. The CEO, though still tense, could not help but glance at her with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. She had done what few dared to do. She had challenged him directly, asserted authority, and ensured accountability, all without shouting or losing composure. He realized that her professionalism had forced him to confront not only the situation but also his own behavior, his assumptions about control, and the limits of power. For the terminated team members, the reality of their situation slowly sank in. The sudden loss of their roles left them stunned, yet it also prompted reflection, a chance to reassess their approach to leadership, respect, and teamwork. In those moments, they began to understand the flight attendant's message: professionalism is not optional, and accountability can arrive in unexpected ways. The passengers, too, seemed changed by what they had witnessed. Some whispered to one another about the courage it took to stand up to authority. Others remarked on how rare it was to see accountability so clearly enforced, even in a space designed for luxury and comfort. Human dynamics and character had proven more powerful than status or title. The experience left a lasting impression, one that would be remembered far longer than the journey itself. The CEO's face, though still tight with tension, revealed small signs of introspection. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, as if replaying the events in his mind. He could no longer ignore the reality that a single act of courage had not only disrupted his authority but also forced a moment of reflection, forcing him to recognize the importance of respect, humility, and accountability. Meanwhile, the flight attendant continued her duties with quiet efficiency, her confidence intact. She had not only enforced rules and boundaries but had also set an example for everyone in the cabin. Her professionalism, composure, and courage had created a ripple effect, teaching passengers and crew alike that respect is earned through actions, not demanded through status. By the time the jet began its descent, the aftermath of the confrontation had settled into a new equilibrium. The CEO, his team, and the passengers were left with a story that none would forget, a powerful example of courage and accountability at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant's decisive actions had not only restored order but had transformed the entire experience into a lesson about respect, authority, and human character. The cabin, once the stage of tension and conflict, now carried an air of reflection and quiet acknowledgement. Everyone on board recognized that something extraordinary had occurred, a rare real-life example of bravery and professionalism. The flight attendant, calm, poised, and authoritative, had reminded everyone that true power is measured not by position or wealth but by courage, confidence, and integrity. As the private jet descended toward its destination, the cabin felt different, almost charged with an invisible energy that was no longer tension, but awareness. The passengers, the CEO, and even the remaining crew were all quietly processing the events that had unfolded. The flight had started as a routine journey, a moment of comfort and luxury, but it had transformed into an extraordinary lesson about respect, courage, and accountability. The CEO, once untouchable in his world of authority and status, now sat in quiet contemplation, his usual confidence tempered by the realization that power is not absolute. It cannot simply be assumed because of a title, wealth, or position. True authority is earned through respect, empathy, and professionalism. He had experienced firsthand how quickly the balance of power could shift, how fragile perceived control could be, and how accountability could arrive in the most unexpected of ways. His team, too, reflected on the events with a mix of regret, understanding, and humility. What had begun as disbelief had slowly transformed into insight. They had witnessed their leader humbled, the usual rules of hierarchy challenged, and consequences enforced with courage and precision. The lesson was clear: actions carry consequences, and respect must be mutual, not demanded. Passengers whispered among themselves quietly, many still in awe. Some discussed the flight attendant's courage and composure, others marveled at the drama that had unfolded at 30,000 feet, but beneath the surface, everyone understood that this was more than a shocking event. It was a reminder that in life, whether on a plane, in an office, or anywhere else, authority is not the same as respect, and respect is not automatic. The flight attendant moved calmly through the cabin, her posture unwavering, her demeanor unchanged. She had handled the crisis with skill, professionalism, and courage, and the impact of her actions would be remembered by everyone on board. her decisiveness had not only restored order but had also taught an unforgettable lesson about confidence, integrity, and the power of standing up for what is right. Even the CEO could not ignore the impression she had made. The flight attendant had redefined the rules of engagement, showing that courage and professionalism could overcome arrogance and entitlement. He reflected silently on the choices he had made, the assumptions he had held, and the authority he had taken for granted. The experience was humbling, uncomfortable, but undeniably transformative. The team members who had been fired, though initially stunned, began to realize the truth in what had occurred. Accountability was not about fear or punishment, it was about responsibility, ethics, and performance. The abrupt consequences had forced them to examine their own actions, their respect for leadership, and their understanding of professionalism. The lesson, though difficult, was clear and unforgettable. As the jet touched down and the wheels met the runway, the finality of the flight mirrored the resolution of the conflict. Everyone disembarked with a new perspective, carrying with them a story that would be retold countless times. The flight attendant's bravery and composure had left a permanent mark, not just on the CEO or his team, but on every passenger who had witnessed her assertive professionalism. The CEO, walking off the plane, glanced back at the flight attendant with a mixture of respect and contemplation. He knew that the experience would stay with him forever, a lesson in humility and accountability that no boardroom or office meeting could have ever provided. The flight attendant, calm and collected, returned to her duties, the quiet hero of the journey, her actions speaking louder than any words. In the end, the story was about more than a slap or a firing. It was about courage, integrity, and the power of standing firm in one's principles. It was about showing that respect is not demanded, it is earned, and that true authority comes from confidence, professionalism, and the willingness to act when others fail. The flight had started as an ordinary journey but ended as a life-changing lesson for everyone involved. Even after the jet emptied and the passengers moved on, the story lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, a reminder that sometimes, the most important lessons come in unexpected moments, and that courage, integrity, and professionalism can redefine power in ways no one anticipates. The flight attendant had not just completed her duty, she had taught a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the cabin.